A passionate couple, a life of luxury, and the criminal underworld. What started as a glamorous romance quickly turned into a nightmare. A seemingly perfect couple found themselves entangled in a world of drugs and corruption. Stay with me to uncover the surprising details of this story. Charlotte Karen Lindström was born on August 9, 1984 in Sollentuna, a municipality in Stockholm County, Sweden. She is the daughter of Hans Lindström and Anita Hall Lindström, who, besides Charlotte, also have another child named Jan, 2 years younger than Charlotte. The family lived in a middle-class house in the suburbs. According to sources, Charlotte had a normal childhood and is very close to her family. Her parents said she didn't have any specific dreams but wanted to feel special. In 2003, at the age of 19, Charlotte went to Australia with a group of friends from her school days. Before that, she had traveled the world with these same friends, but it was in Australia that she decided to stay. In Australia, she settled in Sydney and started working part-time as a model and also as a waitress at a well-known nightclub called Hemisphere. After some time working at Hemisphere, Charlotte applied for a job at a strip club called Minx. This club belonged to a man named Stephen Wayne Spaliviero, who was 37 years old at the time. As soon as Stephen laid eyes on Charlotte, he became interested in her and gradually began to approach her. Stephen quickly realized that Charlotte had a taste for expensive things, and he could offer that to her. Besides the club, Stephen also owned and co-owned several other businesses, ventures that provided him with an excellent income. But Stephen wasn't just a successful businessman. There was a darker side to it all. He was also one of the biggest suppliers of synthetic drugs in the Sydney area, and of course this guaranteed him even more money. Stephen frequented the best and most expensive places in the city, and he only drove luxury cars, such as Lamborghinis and Ferraris. It didn't take long for Stephen and Charlotte to start a relationship. Within a few months, they were already living together in an apartment in Darling Harbour, one of the most sought-after and expensive places to live in Sydney. The couple's life was full of luxury: trips, expensive clothes, jewelry, and everything money could buy. Some people close to Charlotte said that in the beginning she got involved with Stephen out of interest, but later she fell in love with him and was willing to do anything for him. And we can say it was because of this feeling of devotion that Charlotte had for Stephen that this whole case unfolded. In the first few months of her relationship with Stephen, Charlotte discovered that, in addition to being a successful businessman, Stephen was also a criminal. This didn't bother her at all, because after all, Stephen's criminal activities brought in a lot of money, and Charlotte loved spending it. Even though she lived far from her homeland, Charlotte always kept in touch with her family. She visited them twice a year, and they also visited her whenever they could. During all her family visits, Stephen went with her, and he managed to win over her family's affection. However, this fairy tale involving a young Swedish girl and an Australian drug-dealing businessman would not last long. There was no happily ever after here. 2 years after the couple met, more specifically in November 2005, the Sydney Fire Department received a call reporting that an industrial building located in Riverstone, a suburb of the city, was on fire. It was the neighbors of this building who called the fire department, stating that there was a lot of smoke coming from the building. The firefighters quickly headed to the location, and in the meantime, they received another call from a man who claimed that there was no fire at the building they were heading to and that they had actually fallen for a prank. Authorities would later discover that the man who made that call was none other than Stephen Spaliviero. Stephen wanted to divert the firefighters to buy time, but unfortunately for him, it didn't work. The firefighters had already traveled a long distance and they weren't going to turn back, so they decided to check the building anyway. Upon arriving at the site, they found that there were indeed flames, but they managed to extinguish them without any major issues. After putting out the fire and as the smoke cleared, the firefighters came across something they had never seen before. There was a large synthetic drug lab inside the building. There was no one else in the building except the firefighting team. Whoever had been there likely fled as soon as the fire started, knowing it would attract attention. The firefighters notified the police, who then arrived at the scene. The police cordoned off the entire area and began an investigation to search for any evidence that could lead them to the person responsible for the lab. The lab was one of the largest ever discovered in Australia, something that would make the crew from Breaking Bad envious. According to the police report, the equipment was the largest and most sophisticated they had ever seen. There were three 300-liter iron vessels and one 780-liter vessel. On the ground, there were two 50-liter beer vessels with specially made condensers that were being distilled at the time. In a closed room, there were three tablet presses used for pressing pills. In addition to all this equipment, the police seized more than a ton of synthetic drugs ready for sale. According to sources, if these drugs had been sold on the streets, they would have generated millions of Australian dollars in profit. The police also seized a pair of Louis Vuitton shoes and a gas mask. These two items would prove to be crucial in the investigation, as we will see later. A fingerprint was also found on several pieces of lab equipment, likely belonging to someone who spent a lot of time at the site. During the investigation, the police tracked down the building's owner and discovered that he had rented the property to someone else through a real estate agency. In fact, the building owner had left the property in the hands of the real estate agency to find a tenant. The police then interviewed the real estate agent responsible for the transaction. The agent told the police that he had rented the building to a man who identified himself as John Walker, claiming to represent a company called K&M Machinery. According to the real estate agent, John Walker had told him that he intended to use the building to store some company machinery. The police asked the agent to provide a description of the man, and from this description, a sketch of what John Walker might look like was created. Now, the police had a name and a description of the person responsible for that large-scale drug manufacturing operation. However, when they searched the system for the name John Walker and tried to track him down using the information they had, they found nothing. This wasn't surprising to the police, as they already suspected that the identity of John Walker was fake. After all, no one would be foolish enough to use their real name in a criminal operation of that scale. The fingerprint found on several pieces of equipment in the building provided the police with a different name, Jeff Clower. The police tried to track down Jeff, but they couldn't find him anywhere. It was highly likely that Jeff had already left the country. Initially, before the police had seen a picture of Jeff, they believed that John Walker was actually Jeff Clower using a fake identity. However, the sketch created by the police of John Walker based on the real estate agent's description didn't match Jeff Clower's appearance. This indicated that another person was involved in the criminal scheme, someone using the false identity of John Walker. Again, this wasn't surprising to the police, as it was highly unlikely that only one person could manage a drug factory of that size. Let's not forget that the police had seized over a ton of synthetic drugs at the site, a huge amount that couldn't have been produced by just one person in such a short time. The factory had an enormous quantity of chemicals on hand, so the police decided to trace the purchase of those chemicals back to their source. After a few days of investigation, the police located the supplier. It was a licensed company in the region. The police went to the company and spoke with an employee responsible for handling the sales. The employee told the police that a man named John Matthews was the one who purchased all those chemicals. The police showed the sketch they had of John Walker to the employee, who said the man in the sketch looked very much like the person who made the purchase. As a result, the police asked the employee for all the information he had on the man listed in the sales records. Although they suspected that John Matthews was also a fake identity, just like John Walker, the police attempted to track him down. Indeed, John Matthews turned out to be another false identity. All the data the seller had for John Matthews was fake. However, the phone number was active, and when the police checked to see who it was registered to, they made a significant breakthrough in the investigation. The phone number was registered to Stephen Spaliviero. Now, before we proceed with the case, let's take a moment to talk about Stephen Spaliviero's life and the path that led him to become one of Australia's biggest drug traffickers. Stephen Spaliviero grew up in an Italian family in the suburbs of Sydney. After finishing high school, he moved to the United States, where he began working as a luxury car mechanic in a garage in Los Angeles, California. In 1989, Stephen was arrested after stealing a Porsche. At that time, he was part of a gang that stole luxury cars, dismantled them, and shipped the parts to Australia. Stephen was sent to Avenel State Prison in California, where he met a Dutchman named Igor, who taught him how to manufacture all types of synthetic drugs. Later, he was extradited to Australia, where he posted bail and was released pending trial for his crimes. Shortly after, Stephen attempted to put into practice everything he had learned from Igor about synthetic drug production. He set up a small laboratory and began manufacturing small batches of drugs with the intention of gaining experience. However, he was quickly discovered by the police and ended up being arrested. Stephen didn't spend much time in prison, and after being released on bail again, he opened a strip club called Joanna's. The business went bankrupt within a few months, and as a result, Stephen decided to try his hand at manufacturing synthetic drugs again. This time, he rented several remote warehouses around Sydney to avoid drawing attention from people and, consequently, the authorities. According to sources, Stephen was producing thousands of pills per week, which was making him a lot of money. As his criminal operation grew, Stephen started making connections around the world. He bought some of his chemical supplies from the Chinese mafia and began meeting with associates of the Sinaloa cartel to set up a drug lab in the South American jungle. In 2002, Stephen opened another strip club, which he named Minx. This time, the business couldn't fail, as the club was primarily used to launder millions of Australian dollars generated by his large-scale drug manufacturing and distribution operation. The following year, in 2003, Stephen met Charlotte when she applied for a job at his club. From that point on, the couple began enjoying a luxurious and extravagant lifestyle together, and they became engaged shortly after. In August 2005, for Charlotte's 21st birthday, Stephen took her to the Bondi Icebergs Club to celebrate, where he gifted her a $5,000 necklace. At that time, Stephen was still awaiting trial for the synthetic drug manufacturing and trafficking charges for which he had been arrested years earlier. Because of this, when the police were able to connect the phone number registered for the chemical purchases to Stephen, he quickly came back onto their radar. The authorities spent more than a year investigating Stephen. They tapped his phone, placed listening devices in his home, and even attached a tracker to his car. Stephen discovered the tracker but knew there was nothing he could do about it. The police were certain that Stephen was deeply involved in the manufacturing and distribution of synthetic drugs, but they needed to gather as much evidence as possible before arresting him. Otherwise, he might be released on bail again. While monitoring Stephen, the police convinced 2 employees from the company that sold him chemicals to testify in court if necessary. These 2 employees were expected to confirm that John Matthews and Stephen Spaliviero were the same person. After securing their cooperation and collecting some evidence, the police decided to go to Stephen's apartment in Darling Harbour. When they arrived, they were greeted by Charlotte, who said she was alone. The officers showed her a search warrant and then entered the apartment. When asked about Stephen's whereabouts, Charlotte told them that he was in Cooktown, a town in Queensland, more than 1,677 miles away from Sydney. As the police searched the apartment, Charlotte followed them with an anxious expression. The police knew they were unlikely to find anything highly incriminating, as Stephen wouldn't be foolish enough to leave evidence of his criminal activities in his own apartment. Still, they searched every corner, and the only thing they found that might help in the investigation was a Louis Vuitton shoebox. Before leaving Stephen's apartment, the police gave Charlotte a card with the detective's phone number and asked her to have Stephen call them as soon as he returned. A few days later, Stephen returned from Cooktown and called the detective. Stephen knew that sooner or later he would be arrested, so he decided to take a risky gamble. In his conversation with the detective, Stephen invited him for coffee and said he was willing to negotiate, offering the detective money. The detective, however, stated that he was not open to negotiations and that Stephen should report to the police department as soon as possible. The next day, Stephen Spaliviero showed up at the police department and was arrested without bail on charges of manufacturing and distributing synthetic drugs, as well as attempted bribery. Subsequently, Stephen was sent to Silverwater Prison, where he would remain until his trial. Charlotte frequently visited her fiancé in prison, and they talked about everything, including criminal activities. After completing their investigative inquiry, the police realized that the best evidence they had against Stephen were the 2 witnesses who would connect him to the chemical purchases for drug manufacturing. But it wasn't just the police who knew the value of these witnesses. Stephen knew it too. A few days after Stephen's arrest, the police received a tip from inside the prison where he was held. According to an inmate in the same prison, the 2 key witnesses in Stephen's case were in great danger. The inmate informed the police that a plot to kill the 2 witnesses was underway. According to this inmate, 2 men from the state of Victoria, who were already known criminals to the authorities, had been hired to carry out the hit. These 2 criminals were set to execute the 2 witnesses as they were leaving work at the end of the day. The 2 witnesses were already being followed, and their daily routines were being studied to ensure that the plan wouldn't fail. There was even a map attributed to Stephen, showing how to get to and the layout of the witness's workplace. Everything was schemed to look like a robbery gone wrong. Upon learning of this plan, the police became very concerned. Not only were 2 lives in great danger, but the importance of these witnesses' testimonies to the case was crucial. Without them, it was likely that Stephen would receive a much lighter sentence or even manage to evade conviction altogether. Thus, the police knew they had to protect these individuals at all costs. A team was assigned to monitor and protect the 2 witnesses 24/7. In the following days, the police set up surveillance both in front of the factory where the witnesses worked and outside their homes. According to the police, the factory began receiving strange calls in which people asked random questions about the operation of the place. Obviously, someone was trying to gather as much information as possible to execute the plan to eliminate the witnesses. As the days went by, the police grew increasingly anxious. On one particular day, around 5 p.m., a car with license plates from Victoria stopped in front of the factory. 5 p.m. was close to the end of the workday there. Inside the car were 2 men, and the police saw one of them take out a cell phone and make a call. Moments later, just a few seconds, the car left the location. As soon as the car left, an employee at the factory called the police officers who were on surveillance duty and reported that they had just received a call from a man asking about 2 employees. The 2 employees the man inquired about were the very key witnesses in the case. The employee who answered the call told them that the employees were not there, which is why they left the location. The police were one step ahead in this operation because they were aware of the plan to eliminate the witnesses, while the criminals had no idea that the police knew. Before the vehicle with the 2 suspicious men left the area, the officers noted down the license plate number. When they checked this plate in the system, they discovered it was registered to a man with multiple run-ins with the law. Yes, one of the criminals was using his own vehicle registered in his name to commit the crime. Thanks to this oversight, the police were able to identify one of the men hired to eliminate the witnesses. The officers then began monitoring him by tapping his phone. They discovered that the man was in contact with Stephen. In all their conversations, they spoke in code, as Stephen was in prison, and his conversations were being monitored by prison officials. The contact between Stephen and one of the men hired to eliminate the witnesses did not surprise the police. In fact, they already suspected that Stephen might be in direct contact with those contracted to carry out the hit. But one thing left the officers quite shocked. It wasn't just Stephen who was in contact with the hitmen. Charlotte Lindstrom was also involved. Charlotte was in regular contact with the men to check on the progress of the elimination plan. In one of her phone conversations with them, she expressed her irritation and impatience, stating that they were taking too long to eliminate the 2 witnesses. From that point, the police decided to monitor Charlotte and tapped her phone. In the following days, the officers listened to all of Charlotte's conversations with Stephen and the 2 hired men. In one conversation with Stephen, she sounded very upset and frustrated, saying she didn't want to be in Sydney anymore. Stephen tried to calm her down, but Charlotte continued to vent and ended up saying something she shouldn't have, prompting Stephen to tell her to shut up.
How are you?
I don't want to be here.
Huh?
I don't want to be here anymore.
Where are you?
I'm in the city.
What's wrong, baby?
I don't think this is funny.
Huh?
I don't think this is funny.
Oh, no, honey, I'm sorry to put you through, but that's it now. Listen, I'm going to go, eh? I'll leave you alone because you're upset.
So you're going to leave me when I'm upset?
No, I'm just saying, you know, talk. Like,
So I'm going to sit and cry by myself.
just keep it together, huh?
Yeah, no, I just don't want to see those people, that's all.
Just shut up. Talking rubbish about fucking shit. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. I'll speak to you later then, bye.
Realizing that Charlotte was frustrated and impatient, the police decided to use this to their advantage. They devised a plan in which an undercover officer would approach Charlotte, pretending to be a hitman. The undercover officer waited for the right moment, and when the time was right, he approached Charlotte, claiming to be an acquaintance of the other 2 hired men. The undercover officer told her that the other 2 men were having complications in carrying out the job, and from then on he would take care of everything, and that she should negotiate with him. Charlotte didn't find this story suspicious. After all, the undercover officer had information that only someone inside the plan would know. As a result, in the following days, Charlotte began negotiating with the undercover officer. She offered a sum of 100,000 Australian dollars for each witness he eliminated. The undercover officer accepted the deal, and they shook on it. All of this was, of course, recorded and became crucial evidence in the case. On May 26, 2007, Charlotte Lindstrom was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit a serious crime. Some newspapers at the time reported that Charlotte's devotion to Stephen and her desire to help him evade conviction led to her arrest. If convicted, she faced a potential sentence of up to 10 years. A few days after Charlotte's arrest, Dolores Spaliviero, Stephen's mother, offered to pay the bail of 2 million Australian dollars that the authorities had set for Charlotte so that she could face the charges while free. Additionally, her former boss and friend, Justin Hems, stated that if she were released on bail, she could return to work at the Hemisphere nightclub until her trial. However, the judge overseeing the case denied Charlotte bail, citing a high risk of flight. Until this point, Charlotte's family in Sweden had no idea what was happening. They only learned of her arrest when a journalist approached them for a report. Charlotte's parents were shocked to discover that their daughter had been arrested. They were even more stunned to find out what she was being accused of and the entire plot surrounding her arrest. On September 18th, Charlotte struck a deal with the prosecution and pleaded guilty to the charges. As part of this agreement, she was to testify against Stephen and would receive a much lighter sentence than she would have otherwise. On December 21st, she pleaded guilty again in another Sydney court. Throughout all her hearings, Charlotte wore a bulletproof vest due to rumors that her life was at risk. Initially, Charlotte was sentenced to 4 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 2 years. However, a few days later, the court reconsidered the sentence, deeming it too lenient. As a result, the following year, on July 23, 2008, Charlotte, who had already served nearly a year of her sentence, had an additional year added to her term. Previously, she could have been eligible for parole in May 2009, but with this addition, her eligibility was pushed back to May 2010. On August 11, 2008, Charlotte began to testify against Stephen in his trial. She disclosed everything she knew about Stephen's drug operation, providing very important details. According to Charlotte, she had even been to some of the locations that Stephen used to manufacture drugs and had learned a bit about the process of producing synthetic drugs. Charlotte's statements were crucial for the authorities, as they helped link Stephen to the entire drug operation. Additionally, authorities had the testimonies of the 2 witnesses who were employees at the chemical factory where Stephen had purchased chemicals under the false identity of John Matthews. To complicate matters further for Stephen, the gas mask and the Louis Vuitton shoe found at the drug factory contained his DNA. It's worth noting that the shoebox was discovered by police in the apartment where he lived with Charlotte. Due to all this evidence connecting Stephen Spaliviero to the synthetic drug factory, he was sentenced in 2009 to 16 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 12 years. The 2 men from Victoria who were hired to eliminate the 2 witnesses were also arrested but were released a few months later. On May 25, 2010, Charlotte Lindstrom was released on parole from Long Bay Correctional Centre in New South Wales. The next day, she was deported to Sweden, where she served the rest of her sentence near her family. Stephen Spaliviero served 11 years of his sentence and was released on parole in October 2017. He was supposed to serve at least 12 years, as I mentioned earlier, but due to an appeal from his defense, he managed to be released on parole a year earlier than expected. According to Stephen, upon leaving prison, he decided to take a different path this time, one that would not lead him back to crime. He wrote a book called Narco X, in which he recounts the journey that led him to become one of Australia's biggest synthetic drug traffickers, as well as his relationship with Charlotte. He became a counselor for young inmates in an effort to show them that crime does not pay. The latest information I found about Stephen indicates that he is engaged to a woman named Ciara Jones and plans to marry her soon. According to sources, after arriving in Sweden, Charlotte assumed a new identity due to rumors that her life might still be at risk. Because of this, there is no information about how she is doing currently. And that was today's video. Thanks a lot for watching me until now, and see you in the next video.